All right, here we go, guys. Welcome to 7412, the exam prep. We are running this for the next 75 minutes, and then directly after that, we're going to do the 7411. The order is a little bit backwards, but I expect probably a bunch of you will stick around for a little while. So my name is Brian Swittergall. I'm going to be your presenter for this session and the next session. And real brief background. I've been writing certification exam items and working on the actual certification exams for since 2006. And so I've written a ton of items, reviewed a ton of items, seen a ton of items. Can't tell you exactly which tests, but suffice to say that I have a good idea of how to build an item, what an item looks like, looking at the OD and kind of figuring out what areas are good for testing. So I'm going to point some of those out as we go through. There's a ton of content. We don't have a lot of slides. There's like 36 slides, figure 28 slides of content, but there's a lot of data on the slides, so I may skip around a little bit. You know, there might be some bullet points. We may skip over them based on how much time we have. So if there's something you want to cover and time allows, raise your hand. Maybe we can jump back into it.
Is this recorded or no?
Audio is captured and usually up within about 24 hours. And then for the slide deck, if you guys want, I can get you guys a slide deck. I have it out on OneDrive. So I'll get a link to that. All right, quick roadmap server certification slide. So this just shows you where the 412 falls. For those going for their MCSA, this would be the last exam on your way to MCSA, and then you would jump into an MCSE track. So 411 is one behind this. For most people, you want to take 410, 411, 412, and then jump into the MCSE exams. So. All right, so the objectives that we're going to cover today, these come straight out of the exam OD. So if you go up to the website, check it out. These are the same thing up there. And we're covering all 6 here, and they all make up an even portion of the exam. You don't always see that. Sometimes you see a little bit more weighting on some of these, and you can kind of focus your study there. But here it's evenly distributed, so you really need to know a little bit about everything. So these are the functional groups, right? And underneath there, if you look on the skills measure, you'll see some of the more granular stuff that we're going to test on. I put that stuff on the slides, and then we'll talk through some of that stuff as we go. All right, so first up, we're going to talk configure and manage high availability. So that's network load balancing, failover clustering, the clustering roles, and managing VM movement. I think we have about 9 slides on this one. Okay, so first up is network load balancing. This is a pretty big topic. There's a ton of data on this thing. What you're going to hear on all this stuff, and I won't repeat it all the time, but for every role, every service, everything that we're going to talk about, you want to know how to install it, command line and GUI, PowerShell, install -Windows feature, stuff like that. You also want to know the dependencies and the prerequisites. That's going to be a really testable item. So if you need to update the domain functional level, or you need to put R2 on, or you need to do something similar, you want to be aware of those things. I'm going to point out a bunch of those as we go. One other thing to be aware of is like the deprecated stuff. So every time they release an OS, there's something that's been deprecated. So server manager cmd.exe, that used to be what you used to install roles and features. That's deprecated. So if you guys see like an answer on that, steer clear and start heading for PowerShell. All right, so let's talk client affinity types. So we have 3 different types, right? One is we don't have any client affinity. So if you're coming to an NLB cluster, no affinity, you can go wherever you want. The key point about that is that there's no session state information. So what happens is if you're communicating with an application and maybe 2 or 3 minutes pass and you initiate some communication again, you may go from node 1 to node 2. Some applications don't like that when you think about session-based stuff. So if you send your request in a session to another server, not good. The deal with the none, though, is it does offer the best performance. So if you're looking for like an exam item that says, hey, you want to do NLB, and the only thing that matters is performance, be thinking about none. Maybe they don't mention anything about applications or sessions. Single's the other one. So single is all your requests that come in go to one node that you define. And that's like a high availability setting. So if you go everyone to one node, that's good for session state. If that node fails, you can bounce over to the other one. And then the last one is network. That's really taking like a subnet and saying, hey, if you're coming from this subnet, then you go here. If you're coming from this subnet, you go here. That's really good for like internet-based NLB. So focus on internet when you see network. Sometimes you have like a website on the internet and start steering toward that. All right, let's look at the port rules, multiple host, single host, disable. This is controlling traffic at the port level. So you can disable traffic to a specific port by going with a disabled route. And then let's talk one more thing too on this. The cluster operation mode, unicast or multicast. So unicast is one-to-one communication. Multicast is one stream going everywhere. If you have a multicast cluster mode, then the cluster IP address is actually converted to multicast. A little bit of exam trivia. And then finally, the upgrading of the NLB cluster. So this would be like a scenario-based exam item. So you have like 2012 or maybe 2008 R2. You want to update it. The one thing I'd say is the drain stop. So look for an item that might say, hey, you want to do the upgrade, but you want to minimize downtime, or you don't want any downtime. What do you do? And so the drain stop is when you basically say to the node, hey, service who you have and finish out all that, but don't accept anybody new. And when that guy goes down to having no connections, you update him, and then you bring him back into the cluster. And then you switch over to the other side, drain stop that one, and do the same thing. So that's to minimize downtime. All right, so failover clustering. What you're going to see, I'm not going to say, what is failover clustering and when do you use it for the most part. We're going to jump right into the exam testable stuff. So we're talking about quorum, no majority, no witness. You want to be familiar with all these. So especially for even and odd number of nodes. So if you have an even number of nodes, there's, it's a tie. You need a tiebreaker, right? So when you have no majority with a witness, it's an even number of nodes. When you have an odd number of nodes, you don't need a witness. I think that's probably the only thing to remember for the exam. And then the no majority DITS witness only, avoid that one altogether. That's a single point of failure. So you can still use it if the exam item says something like, hey, it's extreme performance, we don't care about downtime, it's whatever, but just be aware of that. So let's jump into cluster networking. So when you use iSCSI on your adapters for your cluster, the cluster communication on the iSCSI adapter is disabled by default. So from an exam perspective, it's like, hey, you're troubleshooting a cluster, or you're putting up a cluster, you're using iSCSI, you can't get cluster communication going. What do you do? Well, you got a problem because you got iSCSI, maybe you need another adapter and another protocol. So, okay, so cluster storage. I think the big thing here is the CSVs, multiple VMs on one LUN. We're going to talk a little bit later about live migration and having a regular disk compared to a CSV. And you can migrate them independently. And I don't list it. I list storage pools up there too. So storage pools, you can go thin or thick. So from the exam perspective, thick, use up all the space right away upon provisioning. Thin, disk space savings, but potential hit on performance. Finally on this one, cluster-aware updating. So you got to have 2012 or 2012 R2. I say 2012 only. It should probably say 2012, 2012 R2 only. It defaults to Windows Update. And from what does it do? So a lot of guys that have clusters, when they're patching them, they put one collection or one server group and it has node 1, and another server group has node 2. One goes down at 8, one goes down at 9. It's all managed manually. So cluster-aware updating is supposed to minimize the administrative overhead of patching clusters. So from the exam perspective, it's minimize administrative overhead. For your updates, start looking for cluster-aware updating. A little bit more clustering. Manage failover clustering. So there's some predefined roles. I list a few of them up here. I didn't want to put them all up there, but you should take a quick look at them before you pop into the exam, because you want to be familiar with them. You might have an exam item that says, hey, you want to bring high availability to a role, and it may not be supported by the cluster. And cluster might be one of your answers, and that's why you need to know these particular predefined roles. And then the generic options. So thinking about you have a homegrown app, you got a BAT file or a VB script or something else that's running, you want to bring high availability to it. What do you do? And there's the generic application, generic scripts that is an option when you add the role to the cluster. But I want to spend some time on this Active Directory detached cluster, because this is a newer one, new for 2012 R2. So they updated the exam OD, I think, in January of 14, and all the R2 stuff came in, and the items got refreshed. And as part of that, all the new stuff, the exam item writers basically look at that new OD, and all the new stuff gets highlighted, a few items are written, and you're sure to see this on there. The key for this one is that you don't have to have a computer object created in AD for the cluster. That's the big difference. The tricky part is that you still have a requirement on ADDS. So the nodes themselves, they had to be joined to a domain. People see Active Directory detached cluster, they think, oh, it's a totally standalone thing, but you still have to have a domain. You just don't have to have a computer object created. And then one other tidbit that's really important. So the Hyper-V role is obviously supported on a failover cluster, but it's not recommended for a detached cluster, because a detached cluster has problems with Kerberos authentication. When you're doing a live migration on Hyper-V, you need Kerberos. So it creates problems. You might have a troubleshooting situation or something like that. You know, you want to create a failover cluster or a detached cluster, and you want to do Hyper-V. Well, now you kind of know where to go. Same thing on the file server. So you can cluster a file server. SMB generally does like to use Kerberos. So without the Kerberos, you can still do it, but it's what I'll call not as good. So avoid that one. All right, so virtual machine movement. Talking about live migration, quick migration, storage migration, importing and exporting. So for live migration, you need to be in the same domain. I think for the exam perspective, a couple of things. 2012 R2 is SMB 3.0 for the live migration. So enhanced performance. From an exam perspective, you might have a 2012 environment. You're not getting the performance you want out of your live migrations. What should you do? And there might be some tweaks on the disk or network, and there might be 2012 R2. So be thinking about that because of the SMB. And then another thing, which is 2012 R2, is compresses the memory. So during the live migration, when you copy the memory over, that's the biggest performance hit. So if you're, again, experiencing performance trouble doing the live migration, go into 2012 R2, gets the compression, and you might get hit with some other compelling choices. So be aware of those two particular features. The storage migration is new to 2012. And what you can do is you can actually migrate the backend storage on your VM while the VM is running. That's important. So exam perspective is, hey, you need to move the storage, you're running out of disk space, something like that, and you want to minimize downtime, or you want to be able to, you want to know that you don't have to shut it down, because a good distractor would be shut the VM down, move the storage, bring it back up. Well, it doesn't minimize the downtime, so you might not get that one. Let's see what else. Importing and exporting VMs. So the export VM is really simple. You run the commandlet, you specify the VM name and where you want to put it. There's pretty much no other options. The key for 2012 R2 from the exam perspective is exporting a live running VM. So it used to be you got to shut them down, then you export them, and you have downtime, and you might import it over here. Well, now, especially for dev purposes, testing, patch, or whatever, you can export a live VM, shove it over to a different Hyper-V host, bring it up, do some testing, and the other VM is still running. And so that goes into importing the VM, right? So when you import a VM, you can either import the VM and then you can not import the exported VM anymore. Or when you import the VM, you can specify a switch. It's the generate new ID switch. I don't have it listed here, but it's in the notes. So when you import one of those with that switch, you can continue to import the VM. So if you wanted to do a bunch of testing, say like patch testing, and you had 8 patches to install and you wanted to isolate, you could export the VM once, import it 8 times, do some testing, and see how it all works together. So be aware of that switch, because there could be something like, hey, I want to import a VM a couple of different times. You know, which commandlet should you use? Which command should you use? Brings us to our first example question. So you manage a failover cluster, Hyper-V. They're all stored on a standard cluster disk. You need to move a single VM from one node to the other without any impact. What should you do first? This is a key question on the exam. You'll see a lot of what should you do. Watch for what should you do first, because some of these might be something you do, but it's just not first. Anybody? B, performance storage migration, VMs to a CSV. Once you're there, now you can do the no impact. And that's why what should you do first? All right, so moving on to configure file and storage solutions. So we have configure advanced file services, quite a bit there. DAC, dynamic access control, and some more storage stuff. Okay, so file services, we're going to bounce around a little bit. Like these high-level headings here are just topics that are listed in the OD. So the one is install and configure NFS. I listed a couple of keys. The support for VMware and third-party hypervisors. It used to be, hey, I want to run all my stuff on NFS, so I'm going to put that on Unix or NetApp or something else. It's totally supported on Windows Server. That's the commandlet to add a new NFS share. There's some new features for 2012 R2 and NFS. It's all tied to basically performance and security. So the new NFS version 4.1, stuff like that. So on the exam, when you have like a 2012 setup with NFS and you want to enhance security or you want to enhance performance, be thinking about an upgrade to R2. All right, so let's talk branch cache. So really only 2 things I'm going to talk about there. Branch cache is, you got a file server at your headquarters and you got some branch offices and they want to come to the file server and grab some data. Instead of having everyone grab the data and saturate your WAN, you enable branch cache. There's 2 modes, and this is what they're going to be testing on: hosted cache or distributed cache. So hosted cache requires a server. You stick it in the branch office. You add the branch cache, and you specify some disk space, and all the clients use that when the cache is available. Distributed cache is no server, and it uses the client. So all the clients maintain their own cache, and they can share. It's almost like a P2P type thing. From the exam perspective, be thinking about security. So, hey, you have a branch office, and you don't have a server room. Which mode should you use? Distributed. Or, hey, you got a small server room in your branch office, and security is important. Which mode should you use? And it's going to be hosted. No, I mean, this has been around since Windows 7. Okay, so file classifications. So this is the file classification infrastructure. This is part of the file server resource manager. It's a role that you install, and underneath there you get a bunch of cool stuff. Definitely want to check this one out. This is a pretty in-depth topic, and if I just stand up here and talk words, it's going to be tough if you haven't seen it. So I'd recommend putting the role on, popping through some of the classifications, some of the rules, looking at the scheduled tasks, being familiar with it. So when you classify a file, you can basically say, hey, this one is PII or this one's sensitive, right? And you can do it at the file level. You can do it at a folder level. You can do it based on automatic rules. And some of the stuff we're going to talk about later is tying in stuff based on classification. So dynamic access control is one, where if you have a file classified as HR, you're in HR, you get access. But it's you want to take a look at it because it's pretty in-depth, and we won't have a bunch of time to spend on this slide. So file access auditing. This is really tied into DAC. Expression-based auditing. So normally, you'd click on a folder, say, hey, audit this and tell me if anybody comes in and reads it. And with expression-based, it's like, well, if you're a member of IT and you try to get into the HR folder, then I want to know about it. And so I don't have to generate a bunch of extra auditing entries. And so think about in that exam situation, it's minimize administrative overhead because you don't have to look through as much stuff. Maybe improve performance, something like that. Okay, so how do you configure clients to know which branch cache mode to use? GPL, group policy, yeah. So that brings us up to dynamic access control. The prerequisites here, the minimum operating systems, 2012 and Windows 8. So that's key. You can still have Windows 7 and stuff out there. They just can't participate. So it falls back to the NTFS. And then you need at least 2012 R2 on as a domain controller, at least one. But watch for exam items where your company requirements are always high availability and things like that. Maybe you only have one 2012 or 2012 R2 DC, so maybe you don't want to implement DAC because you miss your high availability requirements, something like that. Okay, so new terms. I think just knowing what these things are is going to be a big help on the exam. So if you're not familiar with them, these terms are fairly new. The central access rule, the central access policy, which is basically a bunch of rules combined into a policy. A claim. A claim can be something like, hey, I'm a member of the finance group, or I'm a tablet computer. So claims are used in the dynamic access control to say, hey, I'm in HR, I'm on a tablet, I'm on a certain network. All these are claims, and they can be used to grant dynamic access based on all those things. And then I think the proposed permissions. I don't know if you guys heard of that. So when you're setting up DAC, one of the things you can do is proposed permissions. So you're putting all these expressions in place, and you're trying to kind of figure out if this is going to work or not. You can use proposed permissions to kind of get a feel ahead of time before you actually implement it. So configure and optimize storage. So one of the things on the exam is configure the iSCSI target and initiator. You got to add the feature. These are the steps, basically. Add the feature, configure the client, and configure storage. So when you configure the client, anybody remember how to configure the iSCSI client for the first time? As far as where would you go? Yeah, you go to Tools and launch iSCSI Initiator. And at that moment, this is the key part, it'll say, hey, the iSCSI service isn't running. Do you want to turn it on? If you don't turn it on, it doesn't work, right? If you hit no there, you can actually configure the client. You got nothing after that, though. So be aware of that. You can also look for troubleshooting items that says, hey, your iSCSI client isn't getting to the target. What should you do? Maybe you want to look to see if the service is running. So maybe you configured it and it was working and some admin came along and the service stopped, whatever. But check the service. Okay, so ISNS, that's Internet Storage Name Server. No one really uses this. How many people in the room actually use this? Play within the lab. That's usually the case. The good news is you won't see much of this on the exam because most of the exam item writers haven't used it either. So I do point out a couple of things. One thing I'll point out too on my slide. So I've really minimized the bullets on here and the notes. are probably double the length of the slide. So when you guys get the slide deck, if you want it, it's more like an exam cram sheet, right? Everything that I'm saying is somewhere buried in the notes. Okay, so let's talk about thin provisioning and trim. So we talked a little bit about thin provisioning already, but you basically can allocate a 100 gigabyte disk. It looks like you got 100 gigabytes on, in Windows File Explorer. You don't really, and as it fills up, it starts using the space. I think I mentioned performance. Always be thinking about performance. You're going to be looking at one or two things: either maximize performance or maximize efficiency of your storage, and that'll head you down one of the paths. And then there is a resource exhaustion setting, and you can do temporary or permanent. So if you do temporary, the LUN reaches the configured size and has auto grow enabled, then everything keeps working. If you do the permanent, then when you reach the capacity, no bueno, no I/O, everything's offline. So be aware of that. Temporary and permanent. It's pretty self-explanatory if you see it, I guess. Oh, all right. Next question. System admin for Contoso. Sounds just like the exam. So you have a main office and a branch office. You have a single file server. Branch office does not have a secure facility to house servers. And a high latency connection. You need to improve the performance for the branch office users when they get documents. What should you do? B. I told you too much about that one earlier, I guess. I've been thinking about doing that. So business continuity, disaster recovery, configure and manage backups, recover servers. That has an asterisk next to it because we don't have a slide for it. Due to time constraints, we didn't put one in, but we chose that one because everyone knows how to do recover servers, right? And then configure site level fault tolerance. So multiple sites and you want some clustering. We're going to talk about that. All right, so first thing on the backups, WBadmin, that's a command line tool that you want to be familiar with. You can enable it and you can start it, and that starts the backup. But we're missing something. We don't have the role. So you've got to put the role on first. Windows Online Backup is interesting. You have the Azure tie-in to the Windows Server Backup tool now. So there's some key prerequisites for it, which are likely to come up on the exam. One is that you need to download the agent from Azure, and then you need to register the server. If you don't do those things, it's totally worthless, and you can't perform a backup. So from a prerequisite perspective, download and register, and then you can do your kickoff. There's also a PowerShell commandlet that you can use to schedule your online backups, which is new OB schedule, and then your schedule. On the VSS side, VSS admin, create shadow, add shadow storage. The only thing I'm going to say here, know about those commands. Be familiar with maybe 3 or 4 of them and what they do. Maybe try them out once or twice. You won't see a bunch of that on the exam, but it's listed as one of the topics. So there's definitely a couple of items in the pool. All right, so configure site level fault tolerance. Hyper-V replica, that's the configure Hyper-V replica is like the list on the exam. You need to know how to install it. You need to know how to configure it. You need to know how to use it. Could be a little bit of troubleshooting in there. So first, you don't require shared storage. You need to be in the same domain, and you need to have domain membership. So you might get an item, where you've got a couple of Hyper-V hosts. One's a standalone, one's in the domain. You need to move some VMs over right away. What should you use? Replica, export, and knowing those prerequisites will help you get through that particular question. So let's talk planned failover. So that's when you're planning to do like a data center shutdown, or you're planning to move something for maintenance. So there's no data loss on a planned. On the unplanned, there is a little bit of data loss. So I think that's the big thing to know there is if the replica virtual machine unexpectedly takes over, then you're going to have a little bit of data loss. Okay, so configure multi-site clustering. So I think on the use cases, you're talking about loss of a data center. So a scenario-based item would be, hey, you've got one data center and you're putting up another one. You want to make sure that if this one goes down, the other one can take over. That's multi-site clustering's use case. So the big one here is the storage, right? You need to have a way to get the storage from one to the other, and that's typically SAN-based replication. It's usually the storage team. It's usually the storage vendor, NetApp, BMC, whatever you have. That's what you're going to rely on. And I think finally, disk witness, if necessary, but where. So this is the best practice is put it in a third site that has connectivity directly to both the other sites. That's the big thing. You can put it elsewhere, but from an exam perspective, be always looking for a third site for that disk witness. Another question. Previous versions of files on the file server. What tool should you use? Hey, yeah, this one's a really easy one. Never would have passed the exam standards. Would have tossed it out. VSS admin. All right. Configure network services. So advanced DHCP solution, there's some new stuff there. DNS solution, there's a lot of stuff there that people don't touch very much, DNS sec and stuff like that. And then IPAM, which is another one that I don't think a lot of people are using. Let me just get a show of hands for who has IPAM up and running for production.
Not yet. We're doing it right now.
It's not bad, just no one's using it, so it makes it tough on the exam because there's some little things that we're going to dive into on that. Okay, so create and configure superscopes. Superscope is multiple networks combined into one scope. The big thing here is administrative overhead. So you got a whole bunch of scopes or a whole bunch of subnets in a site, and you want to minimize the administrative overhead of managing the scopes. You want to change DNS servers or whatever else you have in there. You manage a superscope as a single unit. So that's a big improvement if you've got a bunch of subnets. Create and configure multicast scopes. We talked about multicast. That's basically streaming. The only thing to know here from the exam perspective is that you can run multicast scopes and DHCP scopes side by side, same server. You don't need anything dedicated. They don't interact with each other. They're totally different. DHCP v6. I think the only thing here, stateful and stateless configuration. So when you have a stateful, it's acquire IP and DNS, and when you have stateless, all you acquire is DNS, no IP. And then lastly, DHCP high availability. There's a lot of information on this particular topic that I just don't have in here. But you can do the failover cluster role. You can do a split scope DHCP, 2 server max, and only IPv4. That's the exam bell right there. Because if you got IPv6 high availability, be aware of that. Okay, so let's talk DNS. We'll start with DNS sec. I mentioned key terms. Trust anchor, one of the key terms for DNS sec. Who here knows what a trust anchor is? Well, yeah, there is an icon. The trust anchor is the public key for a certain DNS zone. But just knowing the definition goes a long way on the exam. What is a trust anchor? You might know that there's some signing and some certificates and some encryption and stuff like that, but what is a trust anchor? That's good for the exam. And then the other one would be Name Resolution Policy Table, NRPT. So that's a table stored in the registry, and it basically tells a client, a DNS client, how to behave. So one example would be, and you can do a lot with it, but one example is that if you're a client and you want to make sure that the response you got from the DNS server is signed, you can use that to do that. And if it's not signed, you just discard the response as not good. So high security environment, something like that. Zone delegation. The only thing I'm going to say here is, you got a whole lot of subdomains, and you want to minimize administrative overhead. You can do zone delegation. We're not talking about zone delegation where you have a junior admin and you're going to let them create some A records. We're talking about zone delegation where, for the namespace. A subdomain handled by these DNS servers. Maybe some other admins handle those DNS servers, but. Okay, let's talk global names. So global names is basically wins, so long story short is you want single name resolution similar to wins, global name zone. You can add it to your DNS server, and then you can accomplish that. There's one key difference, though, in this. I don't think you're going to see wins on the exam, but you never know. Wins is dynamic, both dynamic and manual. Global names is just static, right? So there's no dynamic. So if you actually have to have dynamic registration of single names, global names is not the right choice. It would be wins. Wins is still officially supported, but deprecated. And then finally, that's the command right there to actually enable global name support. The interesting thing on this one, a lot of people don't know, is that period. Anybody know what that period is? Yeah, this computer. So you can also specify the host name, and it can be the local server or it can be a remote server. But if you see the period on the exam, some people say, "Oh, wait, that's obviously a typo." Next choice. But it's totally legitimate. So I did want to mention one other thing. So if you do get an exam scenario where you are asked about wins and retiring wins, hey, you're moving away from wins. And here's the requirements. Anytime you see wins, be looking for the global names. Okay, so here we are at IPAM. So we've got the typical thing, right? The prereqs or the requirements. I've got a tiny bit of trivia there. But knowing the models that you can do with IPAM and some of the weird stuff, which we're going to dive into. So first, IPAM can't run on a domain controller, and it has to be on a member server. So be aware of those. The trivia part is, if you install IPAM on a DHCP server, then IPAM can't discover any DHCP servers. So that's a big problem, since it's partly what you want to do with it. So let's talk about server discovery now. Well, actually, let's talk about that database not being shared. So if you have one IPAM server, you got one database. If you have more than one IPAM server, then you have multiple databases. And all the databases are totally unique. They don't communicate. They don't know anything about each other. They don't share data. So that's a big factor. You can have some data overlap. If you come across this situation where you want to do IPAM across your whole enterprise, but you want to reduce the amount of data or reduce the places you go to acquire your IPAM data, then you want to be thinking about a centralized model. Put IPAM in the headquarters and make sure all the data goes to the one database. And then the distributed model, just to define it, is one server, say at headquarters, and then one server at every other site. So you got a lot of databases. So on the server discovery, we're talking about the discovery of IPAM. So when you set it up, it'll go out and discover all the stuff on your network. So you want to be aware of what it can discover. So you might get a requirement to come across X amount of information, and you want to know what it can discover so you know if IPAM is possibly one of the answer choices. So domain controllers, DHCP servers, DNS servers, and there's one more. Anybody? It's a network-related role. So it's NPS servers. So that's an important one to know. So I guess one final thing on IPAM is, and then we have a example question. After you configure IPAM and you do your discovery, there's another step before you actually get any data. And this is a perfect exam troubleshooting item, which is you have to actually say that you're managing that server. So you can have all your servers added, but if you don't select it to be managed, it won't actually bring any data and you have nothing. This is a tough one, only because it's choose all that apply. And there are choose all that applies on the exam, not a ton of them, but I've never liked them.
Do the exams do the choose X number?
You'll see some choose 2, choose 3. Okay, so you're... So I'll display some of the answers. So first, you've got to add the failover cluster feature. You've got to add the server to the failover cluster. Deploy a new server. And then add the role. NLB, not really part of this whole thing. I mean, that's the key to taking some of these exams is wipe out the items that are irrelevant. In this case, we have NLB. So this is probably a little bit easier than the exam. Okay, so configure an Active Directory infrastructure. And we have configure sites. That's got the asterisk on it. So that means we're not going to talk about that. Sites have been around since Windows 2000. Pretty much nothing's changed. But we'll talk about the rest of this stuff. Okay, so this particular item is configure a forest or domain. All DCs must be the same level or higher. What do I mean by that? So that's, you want to go to 2008 R2 level. All your DCs have to be at 2008 R2. And that's at the domain or forest level.
I have a question about that. I've been studying for this for some time. Is it really possible to raise the forest level to something above your highest domain levels?
The forest level? No.
Yeah.
So
That's what I thought, but it looks like some of the study exam questions.
So when you ask your question, did you mean higher than the DC level, like your lowest common denominator DC, or?
Oh no, I'm at the domain level, right? I mean, can the forest?
Yeah, no.
No, it can't, right?
Okay. So I mean that's the same with the DCs.
Right.
All right. So the question here is, and this you might see this on the exam: can you lower a domain or forest functional level? Yes. The answer is actually yes.
But there's a bunch of
So you can do it in 2008 R2 down to 2008, 2012 to 2008 R2, 2012 R2 to 2012. So maybe an exam item would be, hey, you just updated the level, something's going haywire, and you need to fix it. What should you do? And it might say restore from backup, downgrade the force functional level, and you want to minimize downtime. Well, that's an easy one, right? Okay, so upgrading functional levels, all DCs must be upgraded. We talked about that. Adds features. So this is a big one on the exam. You know, back in the day, it used to be bigger. You know, every time there's a new forest or domain functional level, something new gets added. And there's always the exam item that says, hey, you want to take advantage of something, what should you do? And it's going to be update the domain. But you want to be aware of whether it's domain or forest functional level. So let me see what I got on this. So the Windows Server 2012 R2 domain functional level enhances only a couple things: protected users, authentication policies, and there's some authentication policy silos. It's kind of new, so you might see it. So what features does a 2012 R2 forest functional level provide? None. Nothing. What about a 2012 forest functional level? Nothing. The last time a forest functional level did anything was 2008 R2. Anybody remember? The recycle bin, the AD recycle bin. And that, don't be surprised, even though that's going back a little bit, that is not going back far enough to not be considered on the exam. That would be totally relevant for the exam. Okay, so UPN suffixes. This basically allows users to log in with, bsmith@whateveryoupit.com, the suffix, right? Most people put the domain that they're in, but when you have a lot of domains and the domains are long and you got a lot of subdomains, you can shorten those down. This is improve the end user experience, decrease administrative overhead. That's pretty much what you're going to see on the exam. Can be an invalid DNS name. That's a tricky one on the exam because you might see, hey, just have them log in with this, and you're like, what the heck is that? It's valid. Might be the answer. And then finally, domain or enterprise admin. That's pretty straightforward. If you wanted to add a UPN suffix, you got to be one of those two. All right, moving on. So configure trusts. The good news is these trust types have been around since NT4, even before that. Trust authentication and trust. So let's just go through the trust types. I think the key on trust for the exam is knowing when things are transitive and non-transitive, knowing which operating systems might be involved in certain trust types. So a realm trust is generally relegated to Unix and Linux and non-Microsoft operating systems. External trust is when you want to provide access to resources in another forest. Forest trust is most often seen in like a merger or acquisition where you're going to consolidate the domains in forests and stuff like that. So you're going to implement a forest trust. You see it inside of a corporation as well. And then shortcut trust, this one they like to test on quite a bit. You have a huge environment and there's multiple trusts, and you've all seen that triangle diagram where it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the same down this tree, and then this guy's trying to get down to the bottom and he has to go like this, and the shortcut trust basically takes this guy and lets him go straight across. So improves performance, improves end user experience, response time. So let's talk about trust authentication. So forest-wide, that's pretty self-explanatory. Every user in the forest, all the domains can get to whatever they've been configured to get to. Don't confuse that with all of a sudden they have any different access. They still have to be granted access to stuff. Domain-wide is the same thing, but it's just for the domain. The big one for the exam is the selective, trying to figure out when you use selective in a scenario. So the easiest thing to remember is it's high security, and it's high administrative overhead. Anytime somebody implements selective trust, it requires, you got to hire like 2 or 3 more guys, and everything's going to be a mess for a while. But it's basically individual access, most secure. All right, so password replication and some sysvol stuff down there. So RODCs can cache passwords. We know that. Know how and when to use. So you actually have a few choices. You don't have to cache any passwords. You can put an RODC somewhere and cache nothing. The downside is that if your WAN goes down, no one can get anywhere. But from an exam perspective, that's actually the most secure. So you want to deploy an RODC and it has to have maximum security, then you don't cache any passwords. You can also cache just a few accounts. So that's the most common use case. And when we say a few accounts, it's generally the people that work at the branch office where the RODC is. You generally avoid all the administrative users, anybody that has special permissions, special access, because then their password hashes are out there and maybe it's not secure. The good news is the default configuration already excludes all those people. So you don't have to take any action on that. And then I think there's another one that they describe. It's called most accounts are cached. That one's the least secure, but it also is the best from a performance perspective. Everyone's cached, and maybe you work in like a gaming environment. And it's just a free for all, or an educational institution, so that Anyway. Okay, so sysvol. This one's a little bit older. You know, sysvol used to be replicated with FRS, and this goes back to 2003. But it's still on the exam. This particular topic is called out, so I wanted to put some stuff down here. So the migration from FRS to DFS, domain functional level has to be 2008 or higher. That's one of those keys right there. But let's talk about the actual process. It's kind of ugly down there. The third bullet, this is the process to go from FRS to DFS. But I wanted to point out a couple things. So first, you set the global state to 1. You make sure that things look good. You set it to 2. You make sure things look good. You set it to 3. And you're pretty much done. This particular process, I think they call it express. And what it does is it allows you to roll back. So if something doesn't look good, you can roll back, and you still have FRS, and you've still got your sysvol replication. There's another way to do it, though, where you can just run the last command, the set global state to 3. You bypass all the other stuff, and literally in seconds, you have finished your migration. So from a performance perspective, you need to rush this through or something like that. You might see the long version, and you might see the short version. And you want to be able to differentiate between those two and know when to use them. But the key is rollback. If you do go with the set global state 3, there's no rollback. So FRS cannot be configured, won't come on again. And if you don't have working DFSR, then you got some serious problems. Generally, the recommendation is to go with the express. So we now have an example question. All right, so you're the Active Directory Administrator, Wingtip Toys. That is one you might see on the exam. They just acquired Tailspin Toys, and now they're going to start accessing each other's stuff. Well, at least one way, maybe. Notice the question, too. Which type of trust should you create from the Wingtip Toys domain controller? I'm hearing some C's and D's. C, outgoing forest trust. Moving on. Identity and access. ADFS. This is all the AD stuff besides DS. ADFS, ADCS, ADRMS. We'll start with ADFS. So I think here I've listed some of what I call the key terms. This is kind of like some of the other technologies where just knowing what these things mean and when you use them and what they do will help go a long way. So the relying party trust, partner organization that processes the claims. Claims, I think I covered that earlier. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things I help my students with is resources. The relying party has the resources. The claims have the people or the...
Good point. Yeah. Claims are the people, the devices, both. Claim descriptions. So you can publish those in a couple of different ways. And let me flip through here for a second. Account partner organization. So the partner organization has users will access the applications. And then the big one here, we used to have this federation server proxy role service. And that was, anytime you're going to federate with another organization, you generally want to put a proxy in your DMZ. And they used to have the federation server proxy. Now we have the web application proxy. So federation server proxy could still be on the exam, and it might still be a good answer. So you never know on those because the wordings are kind of mishmash, going back and forth. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, so ADCS, this is PKI, Active Directory Certificate Services. You got your enterprise CA and the standalone CA, and these, you got to know what the difference is and when to use them. We go into the use cases. So first, the enterprise CA requires Active Directory. And so the first thing to think about with an enterprise CA, when you think about an offline root, and you think about an enterprise CA. Doesn't go together that well, because if you're in the domain, you need to be online at least every so often. And if you got to bring it up online every so often in your enterprise and you're offline, that's going to be a huge administrative overhead. Not a good practice. So the standalone CA is generally your offline CA, and your enterprise is usually the one that would issue certificates and that users would interact with. So the standalone, one thing to know, doesn't require ADDS. So you might have a situation where it says, hey, you want to bring PKI to your environment, you don't use ADDS, and you want to minimize overhead, whatever, the standalone one. It might actually say the enterprise one, but it would be invalid because you don't have ADDS. The other thing about standalone is you can't use any templates. And without templates, to me, PKI is pretty worthless, right? So the standalone is really, think about it as offline root, and that's pretty much it. I guess the final thing on that one is, so when you request a certificate from a standalone, it's always set to pending till an administrator goes in to approve it. So troubleshooting item, right? You know, you put your standalone up, you just requested something over the web service, nothing's happening. What do? Have the admin go and approve it. So that's the difference on the enterprise side. When you think about like auto enrollment, I think we're talking about that on another slide somewhere. But auto enrollment is, minimize administrative overhead. I think we're going to dive into that maybe in a minute. Let me just look. Yeah, it's coming up. Let's talk a little bit about backup and recovery. I listed command lines here, cert util. Just knowing that it's cert util goes a long way. I wouldn't memorize all this stuff. You can also do it from the GUI. And that's, you go into the certificate authority, snap in, right click, and you can do the backup and the restore right from there. The only thing I'd say on this one, the restore, if you are going to do a restore, you got to stop the service first. So you might get an item where, hey, you're trying to restore the ADCS database, it's not working, what should you do? Stop the service, restart the server, that kind of thing. Okay, so manage certificates. Here's the certificate templates piece. There's a lot of stuff here. You want to know the difference between like version 1, version 2, version 3. So version 1, you couldn't customize at all. Version 2, you can. Version 3, you can. But what do you have to do if you wanted to customize a template? What's the first step?
Copy.
Yeah. And yeah, copy, clone, duplicate is the official word. So duplicate it and rename it and do all your stuff. So after you duplicate a template and you set it all up, now you go back to your certificate authority and you're trying to put it into play, but you don't see it in the templates. Now what do? Enable it. Yeah, so right click, new template to issue, and you select the one that you've already set up and boom, it's ready. Okay, so let's talk auto enrollment. So the requirements, there's some really good testable material on the requirements. First is the enterprise CA. We already talked about that. The second one would be permissions. So normally to get a certificate, not auto enroll, but just to get a certificate, you need read and enroll. So there's also another permission called auto enroll. And what a lot of people think is, well, all you need is read and auto enroll, but you need read, enroll, and auto enroll. And so it's a really good troubleshooting item, so be aware of that. And then when is it triggered? When maybe you set up auto enrollment and you're trying to figure out when my clients are going to get the certificates. Well, it's a typical group policy thing because it's all configured via group policy. It's boot up, group policy refresh, sign on. And then I'll say one more thing on the group policy front. So let's pretend you put you duplicated the template, you enabled it, you set all the permissions appropriately, and you added it to the certificate authority, all that. Now you go and actually deploy it, and no one's getting it. Well, what's happening? Well, there's a group policy setting on the client side that says enable auto enrollment. If you don't have that, there is no auto enrollment, even if everything else is set up. So that's a key. And then key recovery. So when you think key recovery, think key archival, because without archival, you don't have any recovery, right? So the key archival, I think one thing to know on that is it's configured on the template. So if you were to go into the properties of the template, there's a little checkbox, and it says, enable key archival of this particular template. Once you enable that, then you're going to start archiving. If you already have a template that's out there and people already got the certificate and you enable that, they're not going to get archived. That's like a little trivia. So they need to re-enroll in order to start that process. So the use case here, this is kind of old school, but it's typically EFS. I think scenarios on the exam would be like, hey, I got a certificate for encryption, EFS. I got a bunch of data. The guy got fired or something happened. Certificate's been lost, but you need to get to the data. Now, you might have a data recovery agent, but you might be able to get the key recovered and impersonate the user type thing. Okay, so ADRMS. How many people, this is another one, how many people really run this in production? Nobody. So that's why it's a good one for the exam. I did run this in, well, I mean, no, seriously. I did run this in production. It's a really cool service, but every time I talk about ADRMS, no one's ever put it up or anything like that. I think there's 4 things here. The installation, the templates, the exclusion policies, we're going to talk about these, backup and restore. So like pretty much every other service, avoid us installing it on a DC. But this one's key because if you install it on a DC, there's a service account for ADRMS. And if you put it on a DC, you've got to add it to the domain admins group. And everyone knows that's a horrible practice. But it could still be presented in a small SMB situation where, hey, all you have is a domain controller, you want ADRMS, what do you need to do first? Oh, we've got to add the service account to the domain admins group. So when you go through the installation, you choose a database. So nothing super tricky here, but you can either choose a Windows internal database or you can do a SQL server. Windows internal database, really not supported in production. It does work. Generally, I mean, it's perfect for a lab, but generally you want to go with a SQL server because that'll really enhance the backup and restore capabilities. You select the roles. So there's 2 roles. There is the ADRMS service itself, and then there is the federation portion. So ADRMS, key thing is, it only works internally to a company. So if you put it up and I encrypt some Word docs and I send them to you, you can't get them, right? That's ADRMS. Now, the exam doesn't really talk about ADRMS like in Azure or on the internet because now it's, reality is you really can go out to the internet with Azure RMS, but not going to be covered on the exam. I would say, though, that the identity federation piece, that role service, hey, you've got this other company, you guys are partners, you want to exchange encrypted Word documents. What should you do first? Well, it's going to be that role service that you probably never put on when you installed ADRMS the first time. So let's talk about the SCP. There's one thing, ADRMS and the SCP is kind of troublesome. If you ever go through like a failed install of ADRMS, the SCP seems to hang around forever. And as long as it's out there, you pretty much can't install ADRMS ever again. So there's a little cleanup process. You need to be in the enterprise admins group to do anything with the SCP. So when you go to do the install of ADRMS, you can go through the entire install, but you won't have an SCP because you weren't in the right group. And so you've got ADRMS, you don't have an SCP, so clients can't find the thing. So troubleshooting situation would be, what do you do? Well, put yourself in enterprise admins and then go back and manually do the registration of the SCP. And okay, let's jump down to templates. I won't spend a lot of time here, but templates are basically used to automate the ability for people to protect something. So I want to protect a Word doc. I want it to be HR only and read only, can't print, can't do anything with it. Well, I can put a template that says HR only, no nothing, read only. And when I go to protect docs, I can just select that template so I don't have to individually select all the options. That's the key with templates. Think of it from minimize administrative overhead and make sure that all of your protections similar, right? Standards, I guess. jump down to exclusion policies. You can do by user, by application, by lockbox. So by user means, hey, I have some people in my call center. I don't want them encrypting any of that stuff. I don't want them to view any encrypted stuff. Maybe they're contractors. I don't know. So I can exclude them altogether. If you don't exclude anybody in the organization can use ADRMS and encrypt documents. And they can set those documents so that no one else can read them. So, they're getting ready to leave the company. They, do a bulk protection on their laptop, and they're gone. So there is a way around that. There is an ADRMS super users group. And if you're in the super users group, then you can get to everything that's ever been protected. You don't have to have a super users group, though. So for like a troubleshooting item, it might be, hey, you need to recover this stuff. What should you do? Well, first thing you got to figure out is if you got a super users group, and it's enabled. I won't talk about application lockbox, but you can lock out versions of applications, and the lockbox is what holds the keys. Sometimes there'll be a security vulnerability. They'll update the lockbox version, and you want to make sure your old lockboxes don't get in. Probably not going to see that on the exam. And then the backup and restore ADRMS. So you have the configuration itself, right? And then you have the databases. And there's a trusted publishing domain that's part of ADRMS, and that's one of those key terms to know. And that basically is your configuration. But you can go into the ADRMS console, right-click it, and you export it. You export that, and you back up your databases. There's 3 of them. You're good. And the databases, there's only one that really holds any valuable data. One of them is a logging database. So be aware of that. So I think we have a few minutes left. I've got actually a couple books that I'm giving out. I have 3 books that I'm giving out today. 2 7412 exam prep books. Well, they call them exam ref books. And 1 Active Directory cookbook. So let me think how we'll give those out. But real quick, if you guys want to stop by, I'm working as an MCT ambassador. It's in that room that nobody visits over here around the corner. So I'm going to be there a lot tomorrow, pretty much all day except for lunch. I'll be there Friday for a little while, and then later I'm going to be doing the 411 in like a half an hour. But feel free to stop by. I took the 417. I've taken a ton of exams. I wrote a lot of exams. If you want to throw some scenarios out at me or talk about how the items might look and some of the different item styles and types or whatever, great. Because we'll probably have like 20 guys down there, and we want people to come in and talk to us. Did you just fail the exam? Are you going in to take it? Maybe we can throw a couple last-minute things at you. All right, so for the books, let's go with trivia. So for the first book here, just shout the answers out, and we'll figure out who got it right. This one I've used before, and no one ever gets it, so hopefully somebody in here can get this one. I want to know what the
answer's B.
Good answer. Max length of a password in Windows NT 4. We're getting close. That's Windows 2000.
16.
Okay, let me narrow it down. Between 10 and 20. 14. Who said 14? Got a book. Somebody said 14 earlier?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did as well earlier.
Well, then let's go with 2 books. But I still have another one. Don't worry about it. You can come up and grab it.
Yes. See,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Good work. All right, so last book, which is twice as thick as the other books, so it is more valuable. What is the room number? Who got it first? Yeah, I think he got it first. All right, come on. That was way too easy because I barely remembered that I was going to ask Ralph in the back. Thank
you.
All right. All right, guys, that pretty much wraps up the session. Feel free to come up and chat. I've got a few more minutes. I'll be up here for a little while.